But Julie had taken the time to send me this email because she'd read something about me a few years ago about the work I was doing with the registration. And she wanted me to know that she remembered me. What Julie recounted in her letter, though, was something I'd forgotten. She said, I was part of the boat lift from Vietnam to Gulfport, Mississippi. Her family had come to the United States with nothing. They'd lost everything they possessed, and they'd been resettled in Gulfport, Mississippi. And she was a shy 6-year-old when we met. She and I were in the same class, but she looked different than everyone because she was the only one in our school, or in our grade. Kids laughed at her because she didn't speak proper English. Some children shunned her because she looked so different. And she said, Stacey, I remember you came and sat with me. And she said, you helped me with my English. You would explain things to me in class. And for the next 3 years, we often tried to sit beside each other in school as we went through the different grades. I don't remember helping Julie. I remember being friends with Julie. I remember a young, shy person who was as shy as I was. I wasn't shy, I just didn't like people. So when she was afraid, I was willing to stand up for her, mainly because I don't like bullies. When she had questions, I didn't mind giving answers because I'm the second of 6 children. That's how I was raised. And when she faced challenges, my job was to stand next to her because I watched Sesame Street, and that's what you do with friends. And so for me, Julie's email was poignant, but it was also sad. Because what she remembered of that time was darkness and terror and fear. But she remembered children who mocked her, didn't like her. And the only support she had was a child who also was different. You see, most of my classmates were white. I didn't participate in most of the classes with other children of color, and so when I saw Julie, I was just happy to see someone else with melanin. I didn't know that's what it was called. But I knew that when they called me an Oreo and called her, and I'm saying this only because I think you all appreciate this, when they used disparaging terms like Oreo for me and banana for her, we were locked in solidarity because we knew that our insides were not their business. We knew that our achievements were our own and that we were entitled to the full respect that anyone should imagine and should expect. And the fact that she took time to tell me that 35 years before I'd helped her find her way brought tears to my eyes and joy to my heart. But it also reminded me of why I do the work that I do. Because you see, when I became Democratic leader in 2011, my first responsibility was to build a team. And I fumbled the ball. Because I hired people I knew, and that meant I hired people who looked like me and people I automatically could think of. And so our caucus was black and white. And I was ashamed of myself in that moment because I knew my responsibility was to make certain our caucus didn't look like me. Our caucus needed to look like Georgia. And so I took it upon myself to reach out to 2 organizations. I reached out to DeLeo, and they sent me a young woman named Jenny Castillo. And I reached out to Helen Kim Ho and said, I need someone to come and volunteer for us because I had no money. And she sent someone. We got a volunteer, an intern, a few years later. Her name was Emily O. And a couple of years in, Emily became the communications director of the Democratic Caucus in the House of Representatives, the first Asian American to hold that job for either party in the state of Georgia. Emily was intrepid, and she was also very, very ambitious because she originally set up a call for me with a Korean radio station. Because I said I wanted to share what was happening at the Capitol with all communities, and she said, well, we have this radio station, you should call in on Fridays. It was the slowest news program in history because it was in Korean, and I do not speak Korean. And so I would explain complicated, or try to deconstruct complicated terms from the legislature, and the incredibly kind host would then translate it. And I talk fast and I talk a lot. And so it was a really long program, but it worked. Because over the course of time, we started to build a rapport. I started answering questions about what was happening in the legislature. And that mattered to me because I needed folks to know, regardless of where you began, you were in Georgia now and you deserved to know what was happening. That ethos has driven me most of my life, that we all belong, that we should all have access, and that no one is allowed to tell us who we are. That is why I stood for governor in 2018, and it's why I'm going to keep fighting this fight, both from the private sector and in the public sector, for the rest of my life. But I tell you that because it's not about me, it's about you. It's about why you're here. It's about being in a state that has one of the fastest growing populations, Asian American Pacific Islander populations in the country. A state that has seen a dramatic increase of 131%. We're 500,000 members of the AAPI community called Georgia home. It's about what's at stake. It's about language access. Because part of Julie and my relationship came about because I had the privilege of being able to speak the language of the space, but she should not have been isolated because she was learning. And that's why language access in the state of Georgia is so critical. Why language access, not only on our ballots, but in any information you can receive from our state government, should be in a language you can understand. 81% of Georgians who are of AAPI descent speak a language other than English at home. But the reality is English is something you can learn, but your life goes on every single day. But language access is only part of it. The other piece of it is policy access. I believe that healthcare is a right, not a privilege. And yet in the state of Georgia, 1 in 5 members of the AAPI community are without healthcare insurance. 1 in 5, that's almost 65,000 people who go to bed hoping nothing happens before they wake up because they can do nothing about it. That's a solvable problem in Georgia if we were willing to expand Medicaid. And that's a policy issue. We live in a state where we know that transit is the way business moves. That if you live in a community, you should be able to get from place to place without having to own a car. And that's why on March 19th, the state of Georgia has decided that Gwinnett County can join the 21st century, or technically the 20th century, and expand margin. Now, for those of you who didn't clap, you don't quite understand what's going on. You see, those of you from the Bay Area, you're used to being able to jump on BART. Those of you from DC know the Metro. Those of you in New York ride something. But if you're here in Georgia, you've got to live in 2 counties if you want access to transit, DeKalb or Fulton County. Because for decades, we have refused as a state, and let me change that, the state has refused to mandate that transit be available to everyone. They gave it to counties to decide whether their racism would be overcome by their need for economic development. And finally, it's happening. Finally, we are seeing progress being made on the issue of transit. And Gwinnett County is ground zero because Gwinnett County is the most populous county in the state, maybe second to Fulton. But it is the most diverse county in our state. And the largest population of AAPI members in the state of Georgia live in Gwinnett County. And so you can clap for that, isn't it? But by creating access to transit, to real public transit in Gwinnett County gets connected to the rest of the state without a 7 to 8 hour wait time while you're sitting in traffic, assuming you can get to a bus or in a car. And this is a ballot initiative that's moving forward on March 19th, and it's a nonpartisan issue because we need people to be able to get around if we want to build our economy and make certain people are connected to jobs and opportunities. But you can want good policy advances, you can want language access, but it all comes down to the right to vote. Because in a democracy, policies are set by those who get to lift their voices. And the leaders we select have to be able to hear us. And in the state of Georgia, we do not have a fair fight when it comes to our elections. This is an organization whose predecessor in Georgia knew something about this because they did such an extraordinary job of registering voters that the then Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, raided their offices because he didn't believe it was possible that Asian American Pacific Islanders could organize themselves sufficiently to lift up their voices and start to have an effect on elections. They could have been cowed by that. They could have sat down and said, never mind, we won't do it again, but instead they stood up and they expanded their reach and they deepened their experience. And we have the largest number of people on record in the state of Georgia from the AAPI community that are registered to vote in 2020. They put that newfound power to the test. Now, I was in that election. There were some issues. We had issues that are why I'm here today. Because the roadmap to 2020 and beyond demands that we have the right to vote in the state of Georgia, and that right is not real right now. That right is not true. That right is not universal, and that is wrong. I've started an organization called Fair Fight Action because we know we can fix this. Because we know what the problems are. First, it's registration. Second, it's ballot access. And third, it's ballot counting. The registration issue is one that we are very familiar with, that Advancing Justice knows all too well. Third-party registration is essential to making certain that our communities register to vote. Because whether you're in Georgia or Ohio or California, third-party registration is the strongest determinant of whether low-income or communities of color register to vote. They need someone to come and say your voice should be heard. They need someone to walk up and explain how the process works. That is true whether you are African American, Latino, or Asian Pacific Islander. We know it's true, which is why they're working so hard to stop third-party registration from being true. That's why they've outlawed it altogether in Texas, and they've made it incredibly hard in North Carolina. And in Georgia, they've come up with a couple of new ways to make it even worse. One is called exact match, because the spelling of last names can be different in different communities. And in Georgia, the exact match system blocks your registration by saying that if your information does not exactly match a database, then they aren't going to process your application. And in 2018, 53,000 people were captured by the system, 90% of whom were people of color. That's not an accident. And he knew it was going to happen. The Secretary of State knew it was going to happen because the federal judge told him to stop using the system because it happened. And in response, he went to the state legislature and got them to renew the system because they knew 2018 was going to be a transformative year and they wanted to make certain that transformation didn't happen too quickly. But it didn't work. Because the Asia Pacific, the AAPI turnout rate in 2018 was triple what it had been in previous years. Your voices were lifted up. But the registration access issue isn't the only one. Because we've got broken databases that tell you that even though you've only ever lived in Gwinnett County, somehow you are magically now registered in Gwinnett or in DeKalb. Or worse, we've forgotten that you exist and you need to come back next year if you want to vote. We have to fix the broken database. We have to fix exact match. We have to make certain that third-party registrations are allowed to continue because it's the only way we're going to lift up our voices. But registration is only the first part of the problem. Because the other problem is once you get on the rolls, purging happens in Georgia at extraordinary rates. Between 2010 and 2018, 1.4 million Georgians had their names stripped from the rolls. Now, some of these were legitimate. If you're dead, you should not be voting. But for those who lost their right to vote because someone keyed in the wrong name, misunderstood the address, or simply had animus towards the person they saw on that roll, that is wrong, and we need to make it right. That is what we have to do. But next, there's ballot access. So let's say you get through the gauntlet of getting onto the rolls. The issue is, can you do anything about it? Because in the state of Georgia, 200 precincts closed in the last decade. They were closed, consolidated, or moved. Now, you know I talked about transit. Well, let's assume that you live within a space where your precinct is a mile away. If it's suddenly 10 miles away and there's no train, no bus, and you don't own a car, how are you going to cast a ballot? We had people who stood in line for 4 hours, mostly African American, but it happened across the state. And in Gwinnett County, we had to fight year after year to make certain there were enough polling places open so that people could go and cast their ballots. Because they know that when we lift up our voices, change happens. They know that when we are seen, change is different. And they know that if we vote, we get what we want. And so they're trying to limit where you can go to vote. They try to make the line so long that you get tired and you go home. In fact, it becomes a poll tax, because if you're making $15 an hour and you have to wait in line for 4 hours, that's half a day's pay. And that's assuming it didn't take you an hour to get there and an hour to get back to work. No one who makes that little can afford that much. We know what's at stake, and so do those who want to stop voting from happening. They know that if they close precincts, if they don't allow your absentee ballot request to actually be fulfilled, then you might just give up. And we have story after story of people who applied for those absentee ballots and were told, no, you didn't apply, or yes, you've already returned it, where you're still standing in the mailbox waiting to see it show up. Ballot access, registration. Those are 2 flaws, but the third one, and the most insidious one, is actually getting your vote counted. Gwinnett County, again, the largest concentration of the Asian Pacific Islander community, had the highest rate of rejection of absentee ballots in the state of Georgia, 10%. They base some of it on what they call a signature match. Now, my signature is not the same from Kroger to CVS. And yet they were using signatures to determine whether someone was eligible to vote in the state of Georgia. And if you cross county line into DeKalb County, it was a different story. And if you went down to Clayton County, it was a different story. We had places across the state where people were given provisional ballots even though they had the right to vote. This matters because when you don't believe the system works, you stop believing in the system. And when we stop believing in the system, we stop talking about it. We stop participating. And our silence becomes deafening. And in that silence, someone else decides to speak for us. They decide that the policy issues that matter to us don't matter to them, so they don't get talked about as often. They decide that the issues that animate us don't matter to them, so they stop pushing for them. When your voice does not count, and your vote does not count, you don't believe you count. And so we have to fight for a fair election system in the state of Georgia, and we are fighting with litigation, legislation, and advocacy, and I promise you, we are going to win. But here's what happens next. We've got one other issue on the table. We know we've got to push for language access. We've got to push for the policy issues we need. We've got to have a fair fight in our elections. But we also have to make certain that we count in the 2020 census. The hardest to count populations are communities of color, immigrants, and children. And across the country, those are the fastest growing populations in almost every state. We know that those in DC who are charged with this process do not intend for us to be counted. But they can't count us out. We're launching an organization called Fair Count that's going to address that issue in the state of Georgia, and I encourage all of you to ask the question. I know Advancing Justice is doing this work. I know a lot of you are doing this work, but this work is vital. It is existential. Because our votes won't matter, our voices won't matter if we do not exist. We can fight for our right to be seen. We can fight for our right to be heard. And I'm here to tell you that you're not in this alone. That this is a fight for all of us. Because this is a fight for our country. Because we are America. And this is ours. Let's get it done.